going to conclude in a few moments. Is going to be Chatzos. And we can sit down for another 2 minutes. We're going to conclude the Kinnos. At Chatzos, something very interesting happens. Chatzos, we get off the floor and we go back to sitting on regular chairs in a I don't want to call it a normal year, but in a different year. It's very interesting because when actually was the Bais HaMikdash set ablaze? We all know that the Bais HaMikdash burnt from Chatzos on the 9th of Av until Chatzos on the 10th of Av, which means in every year at the 9th of Av on Tisha B'Av we get up off the floor at precisely the moment that the Bais HaMikdash is being set ablaze. And if you think about that for a moment, it's a little bit funny. We would expect the opposite. We would expect, perhaps, we would start Tisha B'Av sitting on a regular chair, and then maybe at Chatzos we should go sit on the floor. And maybe at Chatzos we should then lay neicha, because that is the moment that the Bais HaMikdash is burning. And yet, we do the exact opposite. And I saw a beautiful explanation, and this year it's even more relevant, because now that we're on the 10th of Av, and as we'll speak, many of the halachos are going to be more lax, more lenient, tonight into tomorrow, as the Bais HaMikdash, the final few embers are burning as we hit Chatzos, which means we have a final few moments to put out that fire and to make it that we were not responsible for burning the Bais HaMikdash. But why do we get off the floor when Chatzos hits? And it's the same reason why Tisha B'Av is referred to as a Mayid in the Medrash. Because precisely at that moment, when we hit rock bottom, only after spending a night of Eicha, of songs, of introspection, of thought, a morning of listening, of internalizing, of trying to be mature and realize why we're here. The culmination of the last 3 weeks, of then the 9 days, Tisha B'Av, the culmination of it all is at that Chatzos. Because at that moment is perhaps that moment of clarity. Because after all is all done, and we're sitting here, and everyone in their moments, and everyone who's left, now that we finally hit the point in time that I think we all realize, the crack, the light is coming in, we're starting to see a little bit of color, we're starting to understand the atrocities that we have gone through. We're starting to realize that all the devastation is traced back to one day. We're finally realizing that we don't want Hashem as that nekuda achas, that one dot. We actually want Him present in our lives. No more sveikas and no more doubts. The ability when we learn and when we dive in to actually connect. Precisely at that moment, that's the moment of nechama. Because that's the moment that we finally are really connected. We really feel like we need the Bais HaMikdash. And when we finally have that real thought, we can get off the floor. The nechama begins. Hopefully the Bais HaMikdash will still be coming in the next few minutes. But even if not, the nechama begins. Then we go into the Shiva de Nechamta, because we've come closer to Hashem. Hopefully everyone is at a point where they left the immaturity outside. Hopefully everyone for the rest of the day, even if it won't be in shul, will be at a point of not joking around, of not doing all the silliness that maybe has been done in the past. Rather, spending some time reading through some of the English Kinnos, reading a book about the Holocaust, coming and watching the different inspirational speeches and videos that we will show, and spending the hours when we're finally at that point and we get off the floor, come to Hashem and actually connect with Him. So we'll conclude with the realization that the Bais HaMikdash brings clarity and purity. I'd like to read to you what the Chida writes about the Arizal. We know that the Arizal, Kabbalah, we don't understand Kabbalah, we don't know what it means, but we know it's something that's beyond us. And the Chida writes, not only, I'm sure many people here know that the Arizal learned Bechavrusa with Eliyahu Hanavi, but more than that, writes the Chida that Eliyahu Hanavi allowed him and gave him nitar be'efer hapara. Whatever that means, the Arizal received the ashes of the para aduma. That's what allowed him to be purified, and that's what enabled him to learn the Torah HaKabbalah. And that Arizal used those same ashes that he receives from Eliyahu Hanavi to purify Rav Chaim Vital, his key Talmud, who was able to receive from the Arizal. We don't understand the Arizal. We don't understand Kabbalah. We don't know Rav Chaim Vital. But there's one thing that we can understand, is that when we have that Bais HaMikdash, we'll have those Efer Para Aduma, and we'll once again be able to be sprinkled and be pure. We try so hard. We try not to be sullied. We try not to filthy ourselves. We try when we fall down to pick ourselves up. But we have to realize that that's what the Bais HaMikdash will bring. And when we realize how great we really are, as we spoke, a boy undergoing chemo, a famous story, and the doctor comes in, the nurse says, it's time for you to go in, please put on the hospital gown. And the boy goes, and he puts on the hospital gown, and he puts his tzitzis on top of the hospital gown. And the nurse says, I'm sorry, it's a sterile environment. You can't go in with whatever you're wearing, that garment. And a boy of 14, turns to the nurse and says, I'm sorry, these strings, this is my protection. I'm not going into chemo without my Jew strings. And the nurse says, I'm sorry, it's a sterile environment. You can't go in wearing anything aside for the hospital gown that we gave you. And the boy again refuses adamantly. And the nurse tries again and again. The boy is not budging. The nurse says, okay, you can wait. And the boy sits in the waiting room for hours, waiting. The nurse says, eventually the doctor will come in and you can explain to him, but we can't take you in for chemo in the way that you are. And hours later, the doctor comes in and he comes out and he sees the boy in the hospital gown with the tzitzis. And the doctor says, what's going on? The boy says, I'm not going into chemo without my strings, which are my protection. And the doctor pulls up his chart, looks it over, and says, I'll be back in a moment. A moment later, the doctor comes back. The doctor says, come quick. You could come in with your strings. Don't worry. The boy doesn't know what happened. The doctor brings him in. They go through a difficult round of chemo. And they come back out. And afterwards, the boy now is there. Now his parents are there. And the nurse and the doctor. And everyone wants to know what happened. It's a sterile environment. Everyone knows. The doctor says to the boy, it's true. Those strings really are your protection. The boy says, what do you mean? And the doctor says, you waited there for hours. I came in. I looked at your chart. And I looked at you. And I realized you're not such a big kid. Why is your chart sending you for chemo for such a high dosage? So I went back inside and I checked it and I realized it was a mistake. If you would have went in for chemo, it would have killed you on the spot. You were adamant. You wanted to keep your strings on. They indeed were your protection. This is not a story of 50, 100 years ago. It's a story that happened within the last 10 years. We are great. I heard it from Ephraim Waxman years ago that it used to be that every convenience store you walked into had these terrible magazines, and that the way that they would describe them, every magazine was a rifle waiting to take a shot at every Jewish neshama. And you walked into such a store, and all around you, all the tumah, all the filth of these terrible magazines were bombs and rifles trying to kill you. We don't have to go into convenience stores anymore. The bombs, the rifles, the weapons trying to destroy us, that eser spherois of tumah is everywhere. We all know that Yosef HaTzadik was labeled HaTzadik because he looked at temptation in the eye. He looked at terrible nisyanis and he said, no. I think it's accurate that we can describe each and every person sitting here who looks nisyanis in the eye day in and day out, who looks at those rifles and those bombs and says, no. Truly tzaddikim. So we come to this point of chatzais, when we come to the point of realization that we got to get rid of all this impurity, and we have to make that one little dot of Hashem we need to back in our lives, and it's only going to happen with the Bais HaMikdash. And as we slowly widen that box, that is where we keep Hashem sometimes, and we try to find areas of chizik, whether it's davening, whether it's learning, whether it's ben adam l'chaveroi, whether it's on the fields, whether it's our own lives that no one needs to know. Sometimes the greatest areas of growth are when no one else knows, because that truly builds your internal muscles. And we realize how great we are. One Erev Shabbos, I was walking to yeshiva, I was actually walking to the Kaisel, and I saw an elderly Jew, and he's walking with 2 bags of garbage to take out the garbage. And he goes to the garbage, and he throws them out. Okay, very normal. And then I see he doesn't continue walking. Anyone who's ever seen these Eretz Yisrael garbages, it's a big pot, and everyone just decides to leave the garbage all around. And he's sitting there in his Shabbos clothing on the way to shul, and he looks around, he sees no one's watching him, aside from myself, didn't see me. And he goes and he starts picking up one bag and puts it in. And the next bag, and he picks it up and it drips all over him. And he's coated in I don't want to know what. And the next bag, and he cleans up, and he wipes himself off, he buns his jacket and he walks to shul. The reason that Jew is so incredible is not only because I happen to know he knows Kol HaTorah Kula, and you could ask him a question in any Pri Megadim in Shulchan Aruch and he'll know what's going on. Not only because he has a chabura of 200 people in the mir, because when he sees something, he takes care of it when no one's watching. Rav Asher Eli is not one of the greatest Jews around because he gives shir to thousands of people, but because when he sees a bacher schlepping a suitcase into the mir, and the boy is carrying up one suitcase up the stairs, and the boy looks down, and his friend says, Yosef, who's that old man schlepping your suitcase up behind you? He says, old man schlepping my suitcase. What do you mean? And he looks down, and he sees Rav Asher Eli is schlepping up his suitcase behind him, because he saw someone who's in need. He saw a suitcase. Why can't I help him? The little actions that each and every one of us do and can continue doing. We truly are those tzaddikim. We look at those temptations in the face. Do we have the ability to be Mekadeshim Shemayim daily? Do we have the strength to be part of a minyan? 100%. But when we realize that we have that strength, and we come to the point of realization that we need Hashem in our lives, that we'll be Mekadeshim Shemayim, like we'll take out that handkerchief like the Square Rebbe while we're bleeding to death, and we'll put it on our head. Who's to know? Maybe it's more difficult to when you're playing ball to bend down and maybe miss a pass and put the yarmulke on your head. Maybe that's more difficult for you, because you probably don't have the same appreciation for a yarmulke like the Square Rebbe had. Who's to know that maybe for you to wake up and come to daven with a minyan is more powerful than someone in the barracks lying down and answering to Kedusha? Who is to know that Yosef HaTzadik was labeled because he looked at that temptation and he ran out. And each and every one of us look at temptations, look at nisyanis, and we say no constantly. But most importantly is when we fall, we brush ourselves off and we don't wallow in our misery. We realize that nisyanis are tailor-made and custom-made for each and every one of us. And as we come to this point of connection to Hashem, and as we're going to get off the floor and we'll wash our hands and we'll daven mincha and we'll put on tefillin, perhaps for the first time we'll realize that when we're binding ourselves with our tefillin, we're binding ourselves to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We wear tefillin and He wears tefillin as well. And we'll come to the point of realization that we need Hashem in our lives. So whether the Bais HaMikdash comes or not, we'll have, as Rav Yisrael Salanter opened up today by teaching us, it will purify us, it will elevate us, it will bring us to a point that yes, we'll have fun, and yes, it will be amazing, and yes, we'll laugh, but we'll know the right time to be serious. We'll know what it means to push yourself for one more word of Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam, for one more Amin Yehi Shmei Rabbah, and ultimately, slowly widen that box of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, bring Hashem more into our lives, and be the ultimate Kiddush Hashem. So we're going to get off the floor. We're going to say Ashrei together. But let us contain and let's maintain a bit of that seriousness to bring us through the rest of Tisha B'Av. Ashrei, Ashrei.